still remember the morning my husband looked at me with eyes that felt like a stranger's. It was quiet in the house, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I was standing by the window, holding a cup of warm tea, watching the neighbor's dog run across the yard. It was an ordinary moment, the kind of moment you never think will become the memory that changes your life. But it did. Because that was the day I realized the life I built from my husband, piece by piece, sacrifice by sacrifice, was slipping away from his hands, and he did not even try to catch it. He stood by the kitchen door, one hand tucked into his pocket, the other holding his phone. He didn't greet me the way he used to. He didn't smile. He didn't even look up long enough for me to read what was in his eyes. I felt something break inside me, small and quiet, like the sound of a button snapping off a shirt. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a soft, painful truth settling in the air around us, that he no longer saw me the way he once did, and that he no longer saw the life we built together as something precious. I remembered trying to speak, but the words tangled somewhere deep inside me. So instead, I placed my cup on the table, trying to steady my hands. The steam rose between us, like a thin curtain, blurring him for a moment. When it cleared, he was still looking at his phone, still distant, still somewhere else. A part of me wanted to ask him, "Where did you go? And why didn't you take me with you?" But the words never came. Instead, I simply said, "Breakfast is ready." He nodded without lifting his gaze, and that nod, that tiny, careless nod, felt heavier than any argument we had ever had, because there was no anger in it, no frustration, no hurt, just nothing. And sometimes, nothing hurts more than anything. I watched him sit at the table, the same table we picked out together a decade ago. I remembered how we laughed on the day it arrived because it was too wide to fit through the door. We spent an hour turning it and twisting it until finally, by some miracle, it slid in. We sat on the floor that night, exhausted, eating takeout noodles and talking about all the meals we would share there. But now, he ate quietly, barely tasting anything. No conversation, no warmth. His shoulders were heavy, but not the kind of heavy that comes from a long day, the kind that comes from a long distance between two hearts. A distance I didn't know how to cross anymore. I wanted to reach across the table and touch his hand. I wanted to remind him of the times we held on to each other like life preservers during storms. But he pulled his hands away when I moved, just slightly, almost automatically, as if my touch had become unfamiliar to him or unwanted. My chest tightened, and I felt a tiredness wash over me, a deep, bone-level tiredness that comes from loving someone who was slowly drifting away. That was the moment. That quiet breakfast with no smiles, no warmth, no shared glances, when I finally understood something I had been avoiding for months, that I was losing him. Not suddenly, not loudly, but slowly, gently, silently, like watching the tide pull away from the shore. And the worst part wasn't that he was leaving. It was that he didn't seem to notice I was still standing there, waiting for him to turn around. Before everything changed, our life looked simple from the outside. We lived in a small, cozy house on a quiet street, the kind where you knew all your neighbors' names and waved even if you didn't feel particularly cheerful. The walls of our home held stories of laughter, arguments, celebrations, and losses. It was a life built with both hands and both hearts. At least, that's what I believed. My husband, Daniel, had always been a quiet man. Not cold, not distant, just naturally gentle in the way he carried himself. He wasn't the type to raise his voice. He spoke softly, often after thinking for a long moment. In the early years of our marriage, I loved that about him. I loved how safe I felt beside him, knowing he would never say something cruel in anger. I loved the way he would place his hand on my back when we walked together, or how he would lean against the kitchen counter while I cooked, telling me about his day in his slow, thoughtful way. Simple things, ordinary things, but to me, they meant everything. We met when we were both in our late 20s. I was working at a small community center, helping organize events and workshops. He came one afternoon to fix a broken door. He was a contractor back then, doing small repair jobs around the neighborhood. I still remember the way he wiped the sweat from his forehead and smiled at me when I offered him a bottle of water. It wasn't a dramatic love story. It didn't begin with fireworks or grand gestures. It began with small moments, quiet conversations, gentle laughs, and an easy comfort that felt rare in a world that moved too fast. We married 2 years later in a tiny ceremony under a maple tree behind my parents' house. The air smelled like fresh grass and warm sunlight. My mother cried softly, and my father stood with his hands folded, trying not to smile too widely. Daniel held my hands tightly, as if promising he would never let them go. And for a long time, he didn't. Our life together was built little by little. We didn't have much money in the beginning, so we learned to find joy in small things. Morning walks, coffee on the porch, Sunday visits to the farmer's market. We saved every extra dollar until we could afford our small home. When we bought it, it needed repairs, but we were happy. I used to say the house was like us, imperfect, a bit worn, but full of possibility. Daniel renovated the kitchen himself. I painted the living room walls a soft, warm color that reminded me of late afternoon sunlight. Every corner of the house held a piece of us. Every shelf, every picture frame, every small decoration, all of it was chosen with love. We wanted children, but nature had other plans. I had a series of miscarriages over the years, each one leaving a deeper bruise on my heart. Daniel held me through every one of them. He whispered, "We still have each other." And for a long time, that was enough. We grew older. Life changed. Work became heavier for him. Responsibilities piled up. And slowly, without either of us noticing at first, the days began to stretch between us. Conversations became shorter. Laughter became rare. We still cared for each other, but the closeness, the warmth, it began to fade in ways that felt too gentle to notice and too painful to ignore. Still, I tried. I cooked his favorite meals. I waited up for him when he worked late. I kept our routines alive, believing that love grows strongest when we water it with effort. I thought that was enough. I believed that as long as I stayed steady, we would find our way back to each other. But I didn't see how tired he was becoming. I didn't see how much he held inside away from me. I didn't see the shadows growing behind his quiet eyes. Maybe I was too focused on holding our life together to realize he was slowly stepping out of it. And maybe he thought he was protecting me by keeping his struggles silent. But silence, I later learned, can be the most dangerous thing between two people. It can fill a room. It can take up space. It can replace love without anyone meaning for it to happen. The morning of that quiet breakfast, the silence between us felt heavier than it ever had. It was no longer the comfortable quiet we once shared. It was a painful quiet, full of unsaid truths and unmet needs. I looked at him while he ate. I watched the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders slumped, the way he seemed somewhere far away. And I wondered, when did I lose him? Was it months ago? Years ago? Or was it happening right then in real time, like a slow unraveling thread? That question settled in my heart, and I felt the weight of it in every part of me, because the truth was, I didn't know how to bring him back. The distance between Daniel and me did not arrive suddenly. It grew in small ways, quiet ways, ways that were easy to overlook if you were not paying attention. But I was paying attention. I watched everything closely, the way someone watches a plant they love, afraid it might wilt if they blink too long. At first, it was just small things, the kind you don't think too much about. He would come home later than usual and say he lost track of time. He would sit in the living room without turning on the lights, staring at the floor as if searching for something he misplaced inside his mind. He would eat without tasting, sleep without resting, smile without meaning it. I asked him one evening, "Are you okay? You seem tired." He nodded. "Just work. Nothing more." I waited for him to say something else, to open the door even a little bit so I could walk through and meet him where he was. But he didn't, and I didn't push. I thought giving him space was the right thing to do. I thought he needed time, not questions. But space can sometimes become a wall if you leave it untouched for too long. Weeks passed like this. Quiet dinners, gentle nods, short conversations that ended before they really began. I tried to reach for him in small ways. I made his favorite soup on cold nights. I left notes on the table wishing him a good day. I reminded him of small memories, hoping to spark something warm in him. And for a moment, it sometimes seemed to work. He would smile faintly. He would touch my hand briefly. But the moment always slipped away too soon, like a piece of thread too short to tie anything together. One night, I woke up to find his side of the bed empty. I found him in the kitchen, sitting in the dark again. The moonlight dimly outlined his figure. His hands were clasped together, elbows resting on his knees, shoulders curved inward. I said softly, "You're awake too?" He didn't look at me. "Couldn't sleep. Is something on your mind?" He hesitated. I saw his throat tighten, as if he wanted to speak, but something held him back. Finally, he just said, "Nothing important." But the look in his eyes, it told me everything was important. Everything was heavy. Everything was slipping. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't. I didn't want to push him away more than he already was. So I sat beside him, quietly, hoping he would let me in on his own. But he didn't. After a few minutes, he stood up and went back to bed without a word. The silence he left behind felt louder than any argument we might have had. There were little signs, so small they could be mistaken for nothing at all, but they added up. He stopped asking me how my day was. He stopped noticing when I made changes around the house. He stopped touching my back gently when he passed behind me in the kitchen. He stopped humming to himself while he shaved, something he had done for as long as I knew him. These things may sound simple. Maybe they are. But simple things often hold the most meaning. I remember one weekend afternoon. I had baked his favorite bread, the one with rosemary he always said made the house smell like comfort. When he walked through the door, I expected his usual smile, the one he always had whenever the scent filled the kitchen. But he didn't notice. He didn't even seem to smell it. He walked straight to the living room, sat on the couch, and stared at the wall. I stood there with my hands on the warm loaf, feeling foolish for expecting something so small, so ordinary. Something that shouldn't have meant as much as it did, but somehow did. I carried the bread to him anyway and said, "I made this for you." He nodded and said, "Thank you," without looking up. I sat beside him, hoping he would soften, but he leaned away slightly, as if my nearness made him uncomfortable. That small movement felt sharper than any words. I asked, "Did something happen today?" He said, "No, I'm fine, just thinking." But his "I'm fine" sounded like a locked door. One thing that hurt the most was how conversations changed. Before, we used to talk about everything: dreams, worries, silly things that made no sense but made us laugh. Now, most conversations were short, unfinished, or forgotten. I would say, "Do you want to go for a walk this evening?" He would respond, "Maybe later." But later never came. I would ask, "Should we invite your sister this weekend?" He would say, "We'll see." But he never brought it up again. I once tried to talk about planning a short trip to clear our minds. I thought a change of scenery might help us reconnect. He listened for a moment, then said, "I don't think it's a good time," without explaining why. I asked gently, "When will be a good time?" He shrugged. "I don't know." His voice was flat, empty. I looked at him, trying to find the man I married, but all I saw was someone tired, distant, and drifting away. There are moments when he felt like a stranger in our own home. I remember one evening, I opened our photo album. I placed it on the table between us and said, "Do you remember this day?" Pointing to a picture of us standing beside the half-painted living room wall. There was paint on my cheek, and he was laughing so hard he could barely hold the brush. He looked at the picture and nodded, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "It was a long time ago," he said softly. "Yes," I whispered, "but it was a good day, wasn't it?" He didn't answer. He simply closed the album gently, as if he was afraid to feel something. I watched his hands, hands that once held mine tightly, hands that once wiped my tears during difficult nights. Now, those same hands felt distant, always moving away from me, always keeping something hidden. The changes continued, quiet but steady. He started taking more calls outside, walking onto the porch or into the garage whenever his phone rang. He used to take calls in front of me, without a second thought. Now he seemed careful, almost guarded. I didn't want to assume anything. I didn't want to accuse him of something without reason. But it hurt, not because I thought he was doing something wrong, but because he didn't feel comfortable enough to share whatever was happening in his life. He also began spending more time alone. Sometimes he would go for long drives without telling me where he was going. Sometimes he would sit in his car for a few minutes before coming inside, as if preparing himself to face me, or preparing himself to hide something from me. One night, after he came home late again, I asked gently, "Are you avoiding me?" He looked surprised, then confused. "No," he said quickly. "Why would you think that?" But his voice trembled ever so slightly, not with guilt, but with something harder to explain. Maybe fear? Maybe frustration? Maybe sadness? I said softly, "Because you feel far away." He looked down at his hands and whispered, "I'm just tired." That word had become both a shield and a wall. The hardest part was the emotional distance, the space between our hearts. I felt it every day, in every room, in every silence that lingered too long. I once asked, "Do you still love me?" Not because I doubted his heart entirely, but because I needed reassurance. He looked at me for a brief moment before saying, "Of course I do." But the words felt light, as if they were made of paper, easily torn by the wind. There was no warmth behind them, no depth, no conviction. I nodded and pretended that was enough. But inside, something ached deeply. I wanted to tell him how lonely I felt, living with someone I loved who felt miles away. I wanted to cry and say, "I miss you, even though you're right here." But I held the words back. I didn't want to burden him. I didn't want to push him further away. So, instead, I smiled. A tired, fragile smile, a smile that hid more than it revealed. The atmosphere in the house began to change. The rooms felt colder, even when the heater was on. The hallways felt longer. The evenings felt heavier. I found myself tiptoeing around him, afraid that anything I said might break the delicate silence between us. I walked softly, spoke softly, breathed softly, as if trying not to disturb something fragile in the air. He wasn't unkind, he wasn't rude, he wasn't harsh. He was simply distant. Too distant to touch, too distant to understand, too distant to hold on to. And that kind of distance hurts in a quiet, lingering way. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. The house was silent. I walked into the kitchen and saw Daniel sitting by the table with his head in his hands. His shoulders were shaking slightly. At first, I thought he was crying. My heart tightened. I stepped forward and whispered, "Daniel?" He straightened quickly and wiped his face. "No, I'm fine. Just a headache." But his eyes were red. His voice was strained. His breathing was unsteady. I moved closer and placed a hand on the back of his chair. "You can tell me if something is wrong," I said gently. He shook his head. "I'm okay." But he wasn't, and I knew it. And he knew that I knew. But he wouldn't let me in. He stood up, walked into the bedroom, and closed the doors softly. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair, feeling the weight of helplessness settle over me. The sunlight from the window cast long shadows on the floor, and I felt like one of those shadows, stretched thin, quiet, fading. Something was happening to him. Something was happening to us, and I didn't know how to stop it. The days continued, each one feeling heavier than the last. His silences grew longer. His smiles grew rarer. His presence felt more like an echo than a person. I tried to hold on to hope. I tried to believe this was just a phase. I tried to believe that love could survive even through seasons of distance. But deep down, I knew something was breaking. Something important, something fragile, something that once held us together. And I feared that by the time I understood it fully, it might be too late to mend it. The turning point in a story is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives the same way dusk arrives, quietly at first, then suddenly you look around and realize the whole world has changed color. For me, the turning point began on a rainy evening, a calm rain, the kind that taps softly on windows like gentle fingers. The sky was gray, the house smelled like warm soup, and I thought, just for a moment, that maybe things were finally settling down. But deep down, I already sensed something coming, not because of anything he said, but because of everything he didn't say. Daniel came home later than usual. His jacket was wet, his hair was damp, and he looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. I greeted him softly. "You're soaked. Let me get you a towel." He nodded without meeting my eyes. I placed the towel around his shoulders, and for a brief second, my hands brushed his neck. A simple touch we shared countless times before, but this time, he stiffened. Not a small flinch, a full, tense reaction, like someone touched by a stranger. I withdrew my hand slowly. He whispered, "Thank you," but his voice trembled slightly, as if carrying words he could not speak aloud. I stirred the soup and said gently, "Dinner is almost ready." He replied, but his tone held no shape, no warmth, no interest. He sat at the table and we ate quietly. The only sounds were the clinking of spoons and the soft patter of rain on the roof. Halfway through the meal, he put his spoon down and stared at the window. "Is everything all right?" I asked. He nodded, but tears formed in his eyes. Small, fragile tears that he blinked away quickly. I whispered, "Daniel, I'm here. Please talk to me." He swallowed painfully. His jaw tightened, his hands shook, but he said nothing. And that silence, that heavy, trembling silence, was the beginning of the change. Later that night, while washing dishes, I heard his phone ring in the bedroom. He answered it quickly, almost too quickly. His voice was low, but not low enough that I could not hear pieces of the conversation. He said things like, "I know, I'm trying. It's just hard. I don't want her to worry." Her? The word hit me like cold air, but I did not jump to conclusions. Fear can twist simple things into painful shapes. Still, something in his tone felt different. Not romantic, not secretive in a guilty way, but secretive in a burdened, shame-filled way. I stood in the hallway, drying my hands on a towel, listening to the quiet breaks in his breathing. When the call ended, he stayed in the room for a long time before coming out. When he finally did, his face was drained, pale, almost frightened. He startled when he saw me standing there. I said softly, "Who was that?" He hesitated. "Just someone from work." "A woman from work?" I asked gently, not accusingly, just honestly. His eyes flickered, and he said, "Yes, a colleague." I nodded. "Okay." But inside, something twisted. Not jealousy, not suspicion in a guilty way, but secretive in a burdened, shame-filled way. I stood in the hallway, drying my hands on a towel, listening to the quiet breaks in his breathing. When the call ended, he stayed in the room for a long time before coming out. When he finally did, his face was drained, pale, almost frightened. He startled when he saw me standing there. I said softly, "Who was that?" He hesitated. "Just someone from work." "A woman from work?" I asked gently, not accusingly, just honestly. His eyes flickered and he said, "Yes, a colleague." I nodded. "Okay." But inside, something twisted, not jealousy, not suspicion, but fear. Fear that whatever he was carrying was heavier than I realized. The next morning, we sat at the breakfast table. He looked at his plate but didn't eat. I watched him, noticing every tremble, every quiet sigh. Finally, I said in a calm voice, "Daniel, I know you're not okay. You don't have to hide from me." He looked up and his eyes were full of things he had been holding back for months. He whispered, "I'm sorry." Those two words hit my chest in a way I cannot explain. He continued, voice trembling, "I've been trying to keep everything together, but I'm failing. And I didn't want you to see me like this." I reached for his hand slowly. He didn't pull away this time, but he didn't hold my hand either. I whispered, "You're not failing, you're hurting, and you don't have to go through this alone." He shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "That's the problem. I feel like I'm already alone, even when you're right here." Those words felt like a door slamming inside my chest. I said quietly, "Is it because of me? Did I do something?" "No," he whispered quickly. "You did nothing wrong." Then he buried his face in his hands. I sat there helpless, watching the man I loved unravel in front of me. Not because he stopped loving me, but because he didn't know how to carry his pain anymore. It happened 3 days later, a Saturday afternoon. The weather was warm, but the air felt heavy, as if the sky itself was holding something back. Daniel was in the garage, sitting in his car with the door slightly open. I knocked gently on the side of the car and said, "Do you want some tea?" He didn't answer. He just stared ahead. I sat beside him in the passenger seat, waiting quietly. Minutes passed. Then he whispered, "I got laid off." My breath caught. "When?" I asked, barely above a whisper. "5 months ago." I blinked. 5 months? He nodded, eyes filling with shame. "I didn't want to tell you," he continued. "I thought I could fix it before you found out. I thought I could get another job quietly. I didn't want you to worry." 5 months. 5 long months of hiding, pretending, suffering alone. My heart broke for him. I whispered, "Oh, Daniel." He went on, voice shaking, but it got worse. I used all our savings trying to stay afloat. I kept thinking something would come through, but nothing did. And the longer I hid it, the harder it became to tell you the truth. I covered my mouth with trembling hands. He added, voice cracking, "That woman who called? She's a recruiter. She was helping me look for something. She's not, I mean, it's not what you think." "I know," I whispered, and I meant it. He looked shocked by my calmness, but it wasn't calmness. It was heartbreak, shaped into quiet understanding. I thought the hardest part would be learning he had lied, but it wasn't. The hardest part was when he whispered, "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to see me as a failure. You built this life. You held it together. And I let everything fall apart." My throat tightened painfully. "Daniel," I whispered, "we built this life together." He shook his head. "No, you held us up. You always did. I was supposed to help you, protect you, support you. But I couldn't. I failed you." I placed my hand on his knee gently. "You didn't fail me." He looked up, his eyes searching, desperate, hollow. Then he said the words that cut deeper than any secret. "I don't know how to be the man you need anymore." I felt tears gather in my eyes. Not because he hurt me, but because he believed he wasn't enough. I whispered, "You're still the man I married." But he shook his head slowly. "No, I lost myself, and I don't know how to find my way back." The silence after that felt final, like a door closing softly but firmly. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, in a voice so fragile, it almost disappeared into the air, he said, "Do you think we should take some space? Maybe, maybe it would be better for you." I felt something inside me collapse quietly, like a house built with care for years, brought down by one soft touch. "You want me to leave?" I whispered. "No," he said quickly, tears falling now. "I don't want you to leave, but I think you deserve peace, and right now, I can't give you that." I held his gaze for a long, painful moment. Then I said softly, "Daniel, I didn't marry you for your job, or your income, or your success. I married you because of your heart. But my heart is tired, and mine is breaking," I replied quietly. That night, we sat on opposite ends of the couch, not arguing, not talking, just sitting, in a quiet so heavy it felt like another person in the room. He finally said, "I don't know how to fix this." And I said, with tears rolling down my cheeks, "Maybe we don't fix it tonight. Maybe we just stop hiding." He closed his eyes. A single tear fell down. And just like that, not loudly, not explosively, but gently, painfully, irrevocably, everything changed. The truth had come out. The walls had been revealed. The distance had spoken. But the damage? The damage was still settling, like dust after something precious has shattered. When I look back now, I realize that the moment I stepped out of our house that night was not the end. It was the beginning of something I did not understand yet. At that time, all I felt was a slow, aching emptiness, a silence heavy enough to press on my chest. I did not know what life would look like without the things I used to do for my husband, without the rhythm of our home, without the routines I had built for years. I only knew that I had nowhere else to go, except forward. I went to stay with my sister for a while. She lived alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building. The hallway smelled like paint and dust, and the windows rattled when the wind blew. But inside, the rooms were warm, and she had soft blankets and a kettle that always seemed to be boiling for tea. When she opened the door for me, she did not ask questions. She just pulled me into a slow, long hug. "You stay here as long as you need," she whispered. I nodded because I could not speak. My throat felt too tight. The first few nights, I barely slept. I would sit by the little window in her living room and look outside. The street lights cast soft yellow circles on the road, and sometimes a stray cat walked by. I would hold a cup of warm tea in my hands and try to understand what had happened to my life. I thought about my husband, sitting in the house that used to be filled with the evenings when I waited for him to notice my tiredness, the decisions he made without asking me, and the biggest wound of all, the moment he chose convenience over loyalty. He listened quietly, really listened. It felt like something he had forgotten how to do. That night, for the first time, I sensed something shift between us. Not a sudden fix or dramatic reconciliation, just a soft willingness, a small step. After the call, I sat with my sister at the kitchen table. She poured tea for both of us. "You're tired," she said gently. "I am," I whispered. She touched my hand. And you're healing. Slowly. I nodded, because she was right. The pain was still there, heavy and familiar, but it was no longer drowning me. Weeks passed. My husband called almost every evening. Sometimes we talked about serious things. Sometimes we talked about simple ones. He told me he started watering the plants in the garden. He said he burnt rice twice trying to cook dinner. I could almost hear him smiling shyly, like a child who wanted to show he was trying. Then, one evening, he asked, "Can I see you?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to return to that house only when I was strong enough. "Yes," I said finally. "We can meet." We met in a small cafe near my sister's place, a quiet one with warm lights and wooden tables. When he walked in, he looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in spirit. He sat across from me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I nodded. "I know. I didn't realize how much you carried until it was gone." I folded my hands on the table. "I didn't want you to realize it this way." He lowered his head. "I never wanted to hurt you." I believed him, but believing him did not erase what happened. We talked for almost 2 hours, not about the past alone, but about the future, about what he wanted to change, about what I needed from him. Respect, partnership, presence. Not gifts or promises, just simple, consistent presence. He agreed, not with dramatic words, but with the quiet honesty that felt real. Before we left the cafe, he looked at me with soft eyes. "Can we try again?" I didn't give an answer right away. I needed time, space, healing that wasn't rushed. "I need to return slowly," I told him, "not all at once." He nodded. "Then slow is what we'll do." And that was the moment I realized something important. Love is not always about holding on tightly. Sometimes it is about letting things fall, letting them break, and seeing what can be rebuilt. Not from old habits, but from new understanding. I returned home a month later, not to resume the old life, but to build a new one. When I walked through the front door, the house was tidy, but different. My husband had moved some things around. The table was cleared. A small vase of fresh flowers stood near the window, and on the counter, there was a note in his handwriting. "I'm learning. Thank you for giving me the chance." I held the note and let out a slow breath. Not joy, not sadness, just a quiet sense of beginning. The days that followed were gentle. He learned to do things he never did before. He made breakfast, not perfect, but sincere. He asked me how my day was and listened without distraction. He walked with me in the garden. Sometimes we sat in silence, and that silence no longer felt heavy. It felt shared. But the biggest change was in me. I learned to speak up, gently but clearly. I learned to rest without guilt. I learned that love should not be built entirely by one pair of hands. And I learned that my presence is not something to be taken for granted. One evening, he sat beside me on the porch. The sky was turning orange as the sun slowly sank. "You know," he said softly, When you left, I thought I would be angry or confused, but I was just scared. Scared that I had pushed away the life you built for us. I looked at him. I did not build it for you alone. I built it for us. But I cannot be the only one holding it together. He nodded with a deep breath. You won't be. Not anymore. The wind rustled through the leaves, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace settle inside me. Not because everything was perfect now, but because we were facing life differently. Because I had returned to myself before returning to the marriage. And that changed everything. Life is quieter now. Not empty, not heavy, just quieter. Like a room where the windows are open and the air finally moves. Some mornings, I sit by the garden with a cup of warm tea, watching the light fall gently on the plants. The same plants I once watered alone. Now, sometimes my husband joins me with his own cup, sitting beside me in a calm silence. We do not talk about the past every day. We do not try to erase it either. It stays with us, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how fragile love can be when one person carries all the weight. A reminder of what happens when silence grows thicker than words. A reminder that even the strongest relationships can become unbalanced if care becomes one-sided. Sometimes he looks at me with a quiet sadness, as if he still carries the fear of losing me again. And in those moments, I simply place my hand over his, not to erase the fear, but to show him that we are both here, choosing each other in a new way, not out of habit, not out of duty, but out of understanding. One evening, we were sitting on the porch together. The sky was soft and dim, the kind of blue that comes just before night settles in. He turned to me and said, "Thank you for coming back." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I listened to the sound of leaves brushing softly against each other in the wind. Finally, I said, "I didn't come back to the old life. I came back to build a new one." He smiled slowly, a gentle smile that didn't rush. "Then let's keep building." Those words stayed with me because they weren't a promise made out of guilt or desperation. They were simple, honest, human, and sometimes that is all a heart needs. Now, when I look around the house, I don't see the place where I once felt invisible. I see small signs of care. 2 cups drying by the sink, blankets folded neatly on the sofa, the plants blooming a little brighter because they are tended by 2 pairs of hands instead of one. It isn't perfect, but it is shared, and I learned something important through all of this. Healing is not loud. It does not arrive all at once. It comes softly, like morning light through a curtain. It touches one corner of your heart, then another, until you realize the room inside you is warm again. I also learned that love cannot survive on sacrifice alone. It needs respect, small acts of care, gentle conversations, the courage to say, "I am hurt," and the humility to say, "I see you." It needs 2 hearts moving toward each other, not one heart running until it collapses. Some days, I still remember the night I left. I remember the cold air, the quiet street, the feeling of standing outside the gate with my suitcase in my hand. But now, when I think of it, I no longer feel the same sharp pain. I feel gratitude, because that moment forced me to step out of the shadows I had placed myself in. It pushed me to express the things I had swallowed for too long. It helped both of us see what we could lose if we kept living on autopilot. And the truth is, We grew from it. Not instantly, not easily, but gently, day by day. As time passes, I feel myself becoming more at ease. I speak more openly. I rest when I need to. I smile more often, not because I'm trying to hold everything together, but because I finally feel held too. In the end, life gave me a lesson I did not expect. Sometimes the biggest change begins the moment your heart breaks. Sometimes stepping away is the only way to let someone see your worth. And sometimes love returns in a quieter, deeper form, one that doesn't ask you to shrink or endure, but invites you to stand beside it as an equal. I don't know what the future will bring. No one ever does. But today, in this moment, I feel peace. I feel steady. And I feel grateful that I had the strength to walk away when I needed to, and the grace to come back when I was ready. If someone were to ask me what I learned through it all, I would tell them this: never lose yourself while trying to hold a life together. Build love, yes. Give love, yes. But remember, you are part of the life you are building. You deserve to be seen in it too. And as I sit here now, watching the evening settle gently over the garden, I realize something simple and quiet. I didn't just rebuild my marriage, I rebuilt myself.